Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So, the MCDM RPG Kickstarter is complete and it appears to have been a smashing success. It was funded over $4.6 million by over 30,000 backers, with each paying over $150 on average against an $800,000 goal. Of course, with Matt Colville behind it and the reputation of MCDM, I think 800,000 was probably a very conservative number. And Kickstarter backers have received the first playtest document, and you can get the playtest document as well. It's not free, but you can join the MCDM Productions Patreon and you can get access. That's $10, which isn't too bad, and you will be able to get the playtest document. So I'm going to put a link to the Patreon in the video description for those who are interested. So I've read through the playtest as well as the 5 sample characters you can play, and what I want to do in this video is let you know what you would be getting, how to play the MCDM RPG, and give you some of my initial impressions. When you see this video, I'll have also participated in a playtest of the MCDM RPG, which is either already on the D20 Play YouTube channel or will be soon. I'm going to link the channel in the video description as well. So to start with, the MCDM RPG is thematically very similar to D&D. It's heroic fantasy that I think you could convert D&D adventures to without too much difficulty. Matt Colville describes the game with 4 words: tactical, heroic, cinematic, fantasy. So if you are familiar with playing 5th edition D&D, I think you shouldn't have too much difficulty with the MCDM RPG. So I'm going to start with the significant changes from D&D. Now there are a lot of terminology changes, and I will cover those later, but for now I'm just going to use the D&D terms we're familiar with. So let's start with actions. In D&D you can move, you can take an action, and take a bonus action if you have one, and you can take one reaction when a trigger occurs that resets at the start of your next turn. With the MCDM RPG, you can take an action or a maneuver, and then another maneuver, and a triggered action which resets at the start of the next round. So you might be able to take 2 triggered actions between turns, or 0, because it's not your turn that resets it. There are also free triggered actions, which, as the name implies, are free, so they don't count against your 1 triggered action per round. And moving, by the way, is maneuver. So on your turn you can move and take an action, for example. And this seems fine. It's a little different than D&D, but it's similar enough. Okay, moving on to dice. In D&D, if you make an ability check or a saving throw, you roll a d20 and then you add your modifiers. In the MCDM RPG, you roll 2d6 and add your modifiers. This does pull your results closer to the average, because the more dice you add, the closer to the average you're likely to get. This isn't the first role-playing game to use 2d6 mechanics, and I do wonder if 2d6 will be maybe a little less intimidating to new players. Like, D&D has a lot of different dice, but non-D&D players are already familiar with the d6, and they're used to rolling 2d6 for board games like Monopoly or playing craps at the casino. For those of us experienced with role-playing games, I think it's pretty much tomato-tomato. Okay, advantage and disadvantage. So the terminology has changed. I'm going to cover all the terminology changes later in the video, but the mechanics for advantage and disadvantage are still here in the MCDM RPG, except, number 1, they stack, and number 2, instead of rolling an extra d20 and take the better result, you roll a d4 and add or subtract it from your total. So let's say, for example, you had 3 sources of advantage and 1 source of disadvantage, then you would add 2d4 to whatever roll you're making. When I covered the DC-20 playtest and I talked about advantage and disadvantage stacking, I did have some comments from people who loved the idea, and comments from others who really didn't. So this is something that's going to appeal to some, but not to everybody. For me, I like the idea of advantage and disadvantage stacking. But here is a big change: attacks. So in D&D, you make a roll to hit, and then if you hit, you roll for damage. Skip that first step in the MCDM RPG. You always hit in this game. I'm going to have to compare this to DC-20 again, because in both playtests, they've simplified the attack process by reducing the number of times you roll dice for an attack. But with DC-20, you can still miss. It's the attack and damage roll combined into a single roll. In MCDM, you never miss. You just roll damage when you make an attack. What that means as well is, whenever you're providing bonuses or penalties to attacks, whether it's from defensive maneuvers or buffing, advantage or disadvantage. It's the damage roll that is being modified, not the to-hit roll, since there is no to-hit roll. Oh, and the damage of most things are 2d6 plus a modifier. And there is a reason for this we'll get into later. But if you're rolling damage, you're generally rolling 2d6 plus something. And here's one that's exactly like DC 20. So in D&D, you have an ability score, and then you have a separate modifier based on that score. With both DC 20 and the MCDM RPG, your score is your modifier. And I like this more. There's just not much point in having a different ability score and modifier when the modifier is all you normally ever use. And yet another mechanic that's the same as DC 20 is distance. So it's not measured in 5-foot increments. It's measured in squares on a grid map, just like DC 20. The expectation in both games is that you're using minis or tokens on a battle map, and so there's no point for the 5-foot measuring distance when you can just use squares. And like D&D, there's no penalty for moving diagonally. Alright, so I'm assuming you are familiar with the grappling mechanics of D&D, but if you aren't, grappling is really good in D&D, but it is also easy to break. If you move the grappled creature with force movement out of reach of the grappler, it ends the grapple. If you move the grappler out of range of the grappled creature with force movement, it also ends the grapple. Not in the MCDM RPG. So, just like D&D, you can grapple a creature and then move at half your speed, and the grappled creature moves with you. But if you're moved through force movement, they move with you as well, at full movement. And if they're moved, you move with them, also at full movement. And this is really interesting to me, and I am going to need to see it and play a few times to really get a feel for whether I like it or not. But I will say I can already see some really weird interactions from this. Like, you could have a chain of allies grappling each other, then use a force movement maneuver, and the entire party would move. And I don't know, maybe that's not a problem, but it seems a little weird. So in D&D, we have a proficiency bonus that scales with our level, and it's added to our saving throws, skills, spell DCs, and attacks for which we have proficiency. There is no proficiency bonus in the MCDM playtest. If you make a saving throw, you're going to roll 2d6 and then add your ability score, and that's it. And if you're proficient in a skill and make a check, then you add a d4. And after level 6, it'll become a d8. And I have to say, thinking about it, I think I'm on board for getting rid of saving throw proficiencies. Because in D&D, you get this weird thing where at high levels you can find saving throws to be impossible if you aren't proficient. But with this system, they have the opportunity to get rid of that. As for the d4 or the d8 on skill checks, again, for me, tomato, tomato, not a feature, not a bug. Okay, so let's talk about hit points. And again, I'm just going to use the D&D terminology. But like in D&D, you're going to have hit points, but if you fall to half hit points, you're going to gain the bloodied condition. The condition on its own has no effect other than other creatures know you're bloodied, but there are certain features where the condition is a factor, like there will be monster attacks that may do more damage to a bloodied creature, or attacks that are enhanced if the attacking creature is bloodied, that kind of thing. We don't have all the details yet. And if you fall to 0 hit points, you do not fall unconscious. Instead, you get the unbalanced condition. This condition prevents you from using the recover action, which I am about to cover, and if you do basically anything that uses your physical ability scores, you take 5 more damage. And then you keep track of your negative hit points, and if they ever reach your bloody number, which is like half your max hit points, then you just die. There is no real going down in combat. You reach 0 hit points, and you're still able to function and take your actions and everything. But healing is harder, and you might take more damage, and if you do go down in combat, it's because your character is dead. And the recover action. So every character can take the recover action, unless they're at 0 hit points or below, to recover 1/3 of their maximum hit points. But you have a limited number based on your character type between each long rest, and there's no short rests in the MCDM RPG, by the way. So your recoveries are kind of like hit dice, but instead of needing an hour, you can use them with an action, as often as you want, until you run out. Okay, experience points. This one is fairly different. So there's no rules yet for leveling up in the MCDM RPG, but we do know experience points will work a bit differently. So every time the party overcomes a challenge, and That could be a battle, but it could be some other achievement. Everyone gets a victory point. How many victory points you have will impact features your character has. Like, some characters can add their victory points to their damage roll once per turn. In other cases, it will give them more resources to use in combat. But when you take a long rest, your victory points turn into experience points. So you go back to 0 victory points. So here is the impact that's going to have on gameplay, and I think I like it, but I am going to have to play with it a while to be sure. So in D&D, after a long rest, you're at full strength. Then as you wade through challenges, whether they're combat challenges or out of combat challenges, you'll use up resources, whether it's spell slots or action surges or hit dice or whatever. And so at the end of the adventuring day, you're going to be weaker than when you started, pretty much automatically. If everything was super easy, at best, you end the adventuring day equal to what you started. But in the MCDM RPG, it's not that predictable. Yes, you will lose hit points and you'll spend recoveries to get them back, and that is going to weaken you because you're going to eventually run out of recoveries. But you'll gain victories, which will make you stronger. So it is totally possible at the end of the adventuring day, you're more powerful than when you started. I mean, at some point, you'll have to just rest because of hit points, but if you stacked up a lot of victories, that's a lot of power in combat before the rest takes place. And what this will do is it's going to give characters less incentive to take the rest. And I should mention that you can sleep for 8 hours in this game without taking a long rest. So if it's a matter of going days and days and days without taking a long rest, you can do that and just build your victory up and up and up and become more and more powerful. Unless you've run out of recoveries, because then of course you have the issue of being closer to death. Okay, area of effect. So in D&D there are multiple ways to take care of area of effect features or spells. Often I'll use a square template to represent a fireball in videos, and then I get corrected in the comments that I should be using a circle. And then I have to explain that I am using the token method, not the template method, as explained in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. In the MCDM RPG, circles are squares. There's no alternate system. If something bursts 5 squares, it bursts 5 squares in every direction. Measuring diagonals is the same as everything else. So on one hand, it is more consistent from table to table, but on the other hand, you don't have the options that D&D gives you. Now for me, this is no problem because I use the token method already. But if you don't like the token method, just be aware, basically it's the same. Okay, big change here, critical hits. So in D&D, if you score a critical hit, you double your damage dice. We all know this can lead to some really dramatic, impactful moments, but it can also lead to a pretty underwhelming result based on which dice you are rolling and how many dice. But with the MCDM RPG, you're not making attack rolls. So instead, you get a critical hit with a damage roll, where you roll your 2d6 and you score an 11 or 12. So that's the reason why most damage rolls are 2d6. So if you roll that 11 or 12 on the 2d6, then it is considered a critical hit, and you can take another action on that turn. Now, you can only take one additional action on a turn, so if you roll another critical hit with that extra action, it has no effect. But you can attack off turn by a number of methods, and if you roll an 11 or 12 on an off turn attack, you get the extra action. So it is entirely possible to get 4 actions in a round if you roll well. Now, there are some damage rolls that don't use 2d6 for damage, like attacks of opportunity, and if you don't roll 2d6 with your damage roll, then you can't get a critical hit. So this is way different than D&D, and one thing I'll say is, it's way more impactful to get another action as far as I'm concerned, so critical hits are going to feel important every time, unless, there's a second one on the same turn. And I think I'm a pretty big fan of this. So I need to cover a change I'm not a big fan of, and I am hoping it gets revised in future playtests, but this is a big one, and that's initiative. So in D&D, everyone makes dexterity checks, then you establish a turn order, and then you move through that order, round after round. In the playtest for D&D, they altered the alert feat, and it now allows you to switch your initiative order with another player character, and I've done a lot of the D&D playtests, and I will tell you, it is a major slowdown to the game. That discussion at the beginning of every combat just slows things down. Well, the MCDM RPG says, hold my beer. So you start a combat and you roll initiative. And the way it works is the DM rolls a d6 for the enemies, and a player rolls a d6 for the party. Whichever rolls higher wins, and in the case of a tie, you keep rolling until the tie is resolved. That part, easy enough. Okay, so whichever side won has one creature take their turn. Then the side that lost has one creature take their turn. And then you go back and forth until everyone has taken a turn. And then the next round starts, and the side that won initiative has one creature take their turn, and so on. And so what this means is until it's the turn of the final PC in a round, every single time the party gets a turn, they need to decide who is going to take their turn, and a turn order is never established. So round after round, this process is repeated. Every single PC turn will involve a discussion until you have a consensus. And the playtest acknowledges that this might be a debate turn after turn, so what the DM is supposed to do is use a 30-second timer, or the players lose the choice. Now, if the one use of alert at the very start of combat is a drag on gameplay, imagine what every player having to reach a consensus every single turn is going to be. And I have tried timers in D&D, and they just aren't very good because they inevitably lead to frustrated players. And frustration isn't the goal of playing a role-playing game. Now, they mention an alternate system where everyone makes a dexterity check, and then you just track the order for player characters and enemies separately, and so you can still alternate that way. And that sounds good to me. It's going to be so much better. So if I'm running a playtest, I'm using the alternative system 100%, and that's what I would recommend. But the standard system presented here, for me, I'm afraid to say I gotta give this one a thumbs down. I think it might sound fine if you read it, but you play it, you'll see. But silver lining here is the alternative is right there in print, so it is totally valid to use it. So I want to put in a little edit here because I have just finished playing MCDM RPG as a playtest, and our DM had a great hack for doing the set initiative system. So we were playing on roll 20, and he had macros set up where we could set our own initiatives to 2, 1, or 0. And if we had a 2, that meant we want to go as soon as possible. If we had a 1 set, that meant that we're ready to go at any time, but we don't really care what order we go in. And if we set it to 0, that meant either I want to delay my action till closer to the end of the round, or I'm not ready to go yet. And we could change our initiatives as we went. And what happened is then, often when it became our turn, it was obvious who went next, and we didn't have to have a discussion. The DM could just say, okay, it is now the Shadow's turn to go. And so I found that hack worked quite well. So I am a little more positive about the initiative system now. I'm going to need to play it some more, but I would recommend that hack to anyone who wants to give it a try. So those are all the big changes from D&D in the MCDM RPG playtest. There's lots of little minor stuff as well, but it should be pretty easy to pick up. Now the playtest is just 32 pages, and there is lots of stuff that just isn't there yet. Like, we have 5 example characters, but there is no rules for how they were created, where their ability scores come from, no rules on classes or races, there's no spells. I don't know if spells like D&D are going to exist, or it will just be magical class and racial features. There's no feats, there's nothing about higher levels, there's no equipment lists, or how kits, which seem to be combinations of equipment, are determined. So there's lots and lots of blanks yet to be filled in. But there's lots of things that are exactly the same as D&D. So, like D&D, you have an always round down rule. You have creatures and objects, and their definitions are basically the same. You have PCs and NPCs, and their definitions are the same. You have actions. You basically have the same rules for trying a check a second time. For opposed skills, the stealth skill basically works the same, and the hide rules are fairly similar to the D&D playtest, where you're rolling a set DC to hide. The rules for stacking effects are basically identical to D&D. The unconscious condition, basically the same. In combat you have rounds and turns, and those are the same. And difficult terrain works the same as D&D. What is not the same as D&D are the terms that are used in the game. So for this video I've been using the D&D terms because those are probably the ones you're familiar with, and they're the ones I'm familiar with. But here is my translation guide, so I'm going to take the D&D term and tell you what the MCDM term is for what is essentially the same thing. So in D&D, we have a Dungeon Master. In MCDM, it's a Director. In D&D, we have an ability check. In MCDM, they call it a test. In D&D, we have advantage. In MCDM, they call it a boon. In D&D, we have disadvantage. In MCDM, they call it a bane. In D&D, we have ability scores. In MCDM, they call them characteristics. In D&D, we have a strength score, a dexterity score, a constitution score, an intelligence score, a wisdom score, and a charisma score. And in MCDM, they call them might, agility, endurance, reason, intuition, and presence, but they're all the same. In D&D, we have a long rest. In MCDM, we have a rest. Of course, there's no short rest in MCDM. In D&D, we have hit points. In MCDM, we have health. In D&D, we have a difficulty class, or DC. In MCDM, we have a target number, or TN. In D&D, we have bonus actions and movement. In MCDM, they call them maneuvers, which include the move maneuver. In D&D, we have a persuasion skill. In MCDM, we have a charm skill. In D&D, we have a tool or musical instrument proficiency. In MCDM, we have a craft skill with a chosen expertise. In D&D, we have the deception skill. In MCDM, we have the deceive skill. In D&D, we have an insight skill. In MCDM, they call it empathy. In D&D, we have arcana, nature, and religion skills. In MCDM, we have a knowledge skill, and then you take the magic, nature, or religion expertise, and it's basically the same. In D&D, we have perception and investigation skills. In MCDM, we have the notice skill. Yeah, perception and investigation are rolled up into one, so pick up the notice skill. In D&D, we have the sleight of hand skill and thieves' tool proficiencies. In MCDM, they call that skullduggery. In D&D, we have the athletics skill. In MCDM, they split it into two skills, athletics and vigor. In D&D, we make saving throws. In MCDM, they call them resistance rolls. In D&D, we have features and traits. In MCDM, we have abilities, which is unfortunately named because we have abilities in D&D too, but they mean a different thing entirely. In D&D, we take reactions. In MCDM, we take triggered actions. In D&D, we may need a clear path to the target. In MCDM, we may need a line of effect to the target. Same thing. In D&D, we may take the help action. In MCDM, we may take the assist maneuver. In D&D, we have an escape DC. In MCDM, we have a break grappled or break restrained target number. In D&D, we take opportunity attacks. And in MCDM, we have a chance hit. In D&D, we might take necrotic damage. In MCDM, it's called corruption damage. In D&D, we may take radiant damage. In MCDM, it's called holy damage. In D&D, we may take thunder damage. In MCDM, they call it sonic damage. In D&D, we may have a damage vulnerability. In MCDM, we have a damage weakness. In D&D, we may have damage resistance. And in MCDM, we may have a damage immunity with a set damage reduction to that damage type. And that should cover pretty much all of the terminology changes, and it's a pretty big list, but my advice to players who want to play test the MCDM RPG is don't worry about memorizing these new terms. They're not really important, because if you say strength, we both know you meant might. And if you say reaction, we both know you mean triggered action. The only unfortunate thing is what ability means, since it means different thing in D&D and MCDM. But that's just one little case, and you know what? We'll figure it out. If you end up playtesting MCDM and you love it, and then it becomes your system of choice, your terminology will just gradually change on its own as you get used to the new system. So, like I said, there's no character creation rules yet, but we are given 5 pre-made characters to playtest. So we have the Dwarf Tactician, the High Elf Talent, the Human Conduit, the Orc Fury, and the Wood Elf Shadow. So, Dwarf, Elf, Human, we know what those are. The Tactician seems to be based on the 4th edition Warlord, so kind of a battle commander that enhances their allies. The Talent is a psionic character with telepathy and telekinetic powers. The Conduit is a lot like a D&D cleric, the Fury is a lot like a D&D barbarian, and the Shadow is a lot like a D&D rogue. And I cannot speak to class or race balance because we don't have the rules for character creation, and so I don't know how many of the numbers on these character sheets are calculated. So what I will say is what we've been presented here is not super balanced. Like the Dwarf Tactician looks really, really good, and the High Elf Talent, not so much. Now this may just be the way they're built. Until I see character creation rules, I can't draw any conclusions. For playtesting though, these may not be perfectly balanced, but they're all good enough that I think if you like the system, you're going to have a good time, whichever one you play. My conclusions as far as this playtest go, I want to see more. Terminology changes, they don't interest me. I roll a 2d6 instead of a d20, fine. I roll a d4 instead of 2d20 and take the best or worst result, no problem. No to hit rolls, and you always hit, that is interesting and worthy of playing to see how it feels. You don't go down at 0 hit points, but you die at negative bloodied hit points. That is interesting. I'll need to see it in play a few times to really develop an opinion. Combat experience making you continually stronger until the end of the adventuring day. I think I like that, but I do want to try it some more. But it is really creative, and I'm up for trying bold changes. What I can see right away as an advantage is this game is not going to devolve into taking rest whenever you can, like D&D can become. That's great. And I think I'm ready to say right now, I really like the critical hit system. Every critical will feel special and impactful. And I am also ready to say right now, not a fan of the initiative system. I think I made that clear enough already. I think I'm going to stick to the alternate system, which is good, and I hope it doesn't stay the alternate. But that is my guide to the new MCDM RPG playtest. And like I said, if you want a copy for yourself, you can get it through the Patreon, which I have linked in the video description. It's going to cost you about $10. And I'm really interested to see where this develops and what becomes of it. It's promising, but there are some big changes that are going to feel really different, and some players are going to go for it and some players aren't. If this isn't for you, that's totally valid. And if that's the case, hopefully I saved you $10. But if you're really intrigued, then hopefully $10 isn't going to be too much of a barrier. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone, and MCDM might be for you. Let me know. Thanks, and I'll talk to you next time.